Hello and welcome to my channel. Here's a charcoal landscape. I like doing those, but I haven't done one in a while. Here we have some fields and a muddy road with some puddles. Let's see how it was done. So the first thing I'm going to do is a little bit of sketching with a piece of willow charcoal. When I do these landscapes, I usually don't need to do too much. I just draw a few lines here and there just to give myself an idea where the line of the horizon will be, where some of the main elements will be. Like for example, here we have a large tree or a couple of trees in the middle of the scene, so just to give myself an idea where those are going to be. Now I'm using some charcoal powder for the sky, and you can see that I'm wiping off the excess of my brush because I want to shade the sky very, very lightly. I just want a tiny bit of value, and I'm going to have some clouds at the bottom closer to the horizon. There's not going to be that much contrast between the sky and the clouds, but I want it that way. So just shading it very lightly using a tiny amount of charcoal powder and blending that and pushing that around with a soft brush until I get a nice gradient, because I want the sky to be just a little bit darker at the top and getting a bit lighter as it gets closer to the horizon. And then we're going to have a few clouds, which, like I said, are not going to stand out in too strong a contrast against the rest of the sky. So it's going to be a slightly cloudy scene with a little bit less contrast. Now I need to start working on some objects in the background on the horizon. And we're going to have a line of trees there in the background. I forgot to say a few words about my materials. So I'm using woodless charcoal pencils. These are Master's Touch woodless charcoal pencils. I'm using two grades, a medium and a soft. The one that I'm using now in a pencil holder, that's the medium grade. The longer one will be the soft charcoal pencil. I'm going to use that one sparingly. Most of the work is going to be done with this medium charcoal pencil. In addition to those, I'm going to be using willow charcoal, and as you already saw, I used a bit of charcoal powder. I created that charcoal powder by sharpening one of my pencils. And I don't think I'm going to be using it anymore during the process of this video. And now I'm drawing those trees in the background. What I'm doing here is I'm making very short circular marks to imitate the appearance of foliage as seen from a distance. So I want to make these shapes look like distant canopies of trees, maybe some bushes and trees in the distance. That's why the upper edge is so irregular, and that's why I'm creating so much texture. Now, what I mean by texture is those small lines and marks that are created by making those short strokes and marks. And they can just help to create an illusion of foliage on a tree. This is a kneaded eraser I'm using right now. I'm using it to lift up a little bit of charcoal from the sky and to create some lighter shapes to draw some clouds. And then on the top edge I'm going to use a pencil eraser to further clean up that upper edge of the clouds. Now, like I said, there's not going to be much contrast here. I just want some suggestions of clouds. That's going to be enough. And I don't really need this part of the scene to be very detailed, and I don't need it to be too distracting. The whole scene is supposed to look like a landscape after a rainy day, I suppose. I did a bit of softening of these shapes with a brush, because I thought that the texture was a little bit too much. It was a little bit too grainy, so I softened it just a little bit. And after that, I refined the shapes a little bit more using a combination of an eraser and a pencil, just to give that row of trees in the back a little bit more shape and depth, just so that it would look like it's not just a mass of trees and foliage, but maybe we can discern individual trees as I'm adding a little bit of shadow in between them and taking away a bit of value on the top part of them, which is kind of facing upwards towards the light source. Now, in front of this row of trees, we're going to have a couple of larger trees here in the midground, and these will need to be a bit more detailed. So you can see that I'm putting a little bit more effort into drawing these branches. I'm not going to do the whole tree just yet. I just started working on it a little bit so that I could give myself a rough idea about its position. I will work out the exact shape a little bit later, and so that I could give myself an idea about its shape. Now after that, I'm continuing with this piece of willow charcoal and sketching a little bit more of those elements in the foreground, trying to decide where those puddles will be. The reason why I have to work around them now, why I have to decide where they will be positioned, is because I want to keep that part of my drawing clean, because those puddles will be a lot lighter in value than everything around them, because they're reflecting the sky. So they're going to be a lot lighter. So I need to try to keep them clean. Now, as for this field on the left, I need to give it a bit more texture. And the texture that I'm trying to create is a whole bunch of vertical shapes, or at least a suggestion of a multitude of vertical shapes of, let's say, wheat stalks. And I did that by drawing a lot of these vertical marks, but I didn't do it entirely randomly, because the ones that are closer to us, closer to our viewpoint, are larger and taller. The ones that are further back are smaller and smaller. So after I put those in, I did a lot of blending. But the good thing about brushes is that even when you blend over those marks, you don't remove them entirely, so you can soften the marks a little bit, but some of the texture still remains, and you're able to work with that and maybe refine those shapes a little bit. The paper I'm working on, by the way, is about 220 GSM, and I've secured it with a bit of tape, which I put around the border, and it's secured to a piece of cardboard. That's how I normally do things. And now I'm adding some even darker marks in this field. The reason why I'm doing this is because I felt that it looked a little bit too flat and that I needed to add a bit more depth in between those individual plants. So this is kind of like drawing grass, and we're going to see the same process when I start drawing the grass under it. Basically, when you're drawing grass, you have a lot of blades of grass, but you can't draw every single blade of grass. They're usually grouped in clumps or clusters, and what you want to do is make some suggestions of those clusters, and you can do that by making an indication that there are some darker or shadow areas in between those clumps, and then you pull some lighter strokes on top for those blades of grass which are sticking out and which are catching more light from above. So I'm going to do the same thing with this wheat field to the left, but of course these are going to be a little bit larger and a little bit taller. Whenever I feel like I've produced too much texture or the texture looks a little bit ugly, I just go and soften it a bit with a brush. So this lower portion to the right of that field is going to be slightly shorter grass. It's going to be an area of shorter grass, and then there's going to be that dirt road or dirt path, whatever it is, with some puddles in it. I'm still reworking this field a little bit, adding some more of the darker shadow areas in between. And notice how I added these continuous darker lines, kind of like to suggest that there's a little bit of a space in between the rows of those stalks of wheat, and of course a little bit of shadow in between them. Now I'm trying to work on some details on the grass here, adding some darker areas, shadow areas, adding some smaller marks. Now once I've done that, I need to work on these highlights using a pencil eraser, and I'm going to use it to draw those lighter parts of the field where the plants are sticking up and catching more light from the light source. And I want to make the field a little bit lighter at the top, closer to that row of trees, and then getting a bit darker here at the bottom where the field joins the grass, because that's our shadow area. And also, as I'm pulling these strokes, I want to change their direction. I want to vary the direction just a little bit so that it doesn't look too uniform. So I'm kind of making it look like some of them are leaning a little bit more this way, some of them are leaning a little bit more that way. And I'm going to do the same thing with the grass, with these blades of grass here. And of course, the ones that are closer to us are going to be a bit larger, so I'm going to be pulling some slightly larger strokes, and the ones that are further away are smaller and smaller and getting less and less defined, and kind of disappearing into the distance, or merging in the distance, merging with other shapes, so that we can't really make out individual shapes. But these small suggestions, they go a long way, and you don't have to draw every single detail in order to create a realistic looking field or realistic looking grass. So the idea here is that there's a dirt road and there's a little bit of this shorter grass growing on the side of the road and even covering some portions of the road. It's a dirt road, and there's going to be some puddles there. There's going to be some mud. I'm still refining this grassy area to the right of the field, adding some smaller, lighter marks using a pencil eraser. This is a Kohinoor pencil eraser. It's a tool for precision erasing. I tend to use it most of the time. Now that I've done most of the work on the left side of this scene, I'm gonna do a bit more work on the tree, just working on the outer shape, on the outline of this tree, which is going to be very irregular, obviously, because it's foliage and because it's just a bunch of either individual leaves or clusters of leaves. So I'm drawing all of this and allowing my hand and my pencil to wiggle a little bit and to create these irregular jagged shapes so that I could imitate that irregular outer shape of the tree. And in front of it there's going to be another field, but here at the bottom there's going to be a bit more shadow. Now this here is either a large tree or maybe a group of trees with some bushes around them. It doesn't really matter. I don't really need to try to explain every single detail to the viewer. I can just simplify certain things or leave certain things to the imagination of the viewer. So I'm going to draw a bunch of branches and leaves, and it's maybe going to look like a couple of trees bunched together, or a single large tree, doesn't really matter. The tool that I'm using to draw these leaves on the edges, or these clusters of leaves on the edges, is a piece of willow charcoal. I find that it's a very convenient tool when drawing foliage, because it allows me to create these slightly larger marks that I can easily vary their direction and shape, because that's what you want to do when you draw foliage, because you don't want to make them all look the same. I see a lot of artists create very realistic landscapes, and the problem with the foliage is that it all looks a little bit too regular, almost like it was copied and pasted. But what you want to do is you want to try to avoid that by varying the amount of pressure you're using, the direction of your strokes, the angle, and of course the shape and the size of those marks. I just want to make it look like a whole bunch of leaves kind of swaying and flying every which way. And the reason why some of those smaller shapes are detached from the rest of the shapes is because these leaves are connected by others, connected to others through small twigs, and we can't really see all of them in the distance. That's why drawing a few of those detached leaves here and there around the edge makes this look so realistic. The key here is also creating that complex texture, and often when you're drawing trees as seen from a distance, you can do that very easily just by allowing the pencil to work for you. You just drag the pencil, make sure that your marks, that your strokes aren't too long and too large, and you'll produce a very fine texture that kind of looks like foliage as seen from a distance. Now, in this large dark shape, I want to maybe make some suggestions of smaller shapes in that canopy, like maybe some parts of that canopy are a little bit darker because they're in the shadow, while other parts of the canopy are just a little bit lighter because they're catching more light from above. But because this whole tree is kind of facing against that light of the background of the sky, it's a little bit darker, so we have an opportunity to create a lot of contrast there. And that's in fact the main purpose of this tree in the scene, to create the contrast with that sky, and also to maybe create the contrast with the rest of the background, with that row of trees in the background, so that I can also give that scene a bit more depth. Now I'm finishing the work on this tree and drawing some of those lower hanging branches and leaves on the right, and these are a little bit darker, so I used a bit of the soft charcoal pencil there. And now I'm moving on to the row of trees to the right. This one is going to appear a little bit larger than the one on the left, and the reason why that is so is because this group of trees is a bit closer to us. It's a little bit closer to our viewpoint. So we're going to make them a bit larger, so we can use that difference in size to convey a feeling of depth to the viewer. We can vary the size of objects to suggest that some objects are closer to us while others are much further away. And the trees on the left are obviously maybe a couple hundred meters further away than this tall tree in the middle. Even though when you're in nature it's kind of difficult to gauge these distances because there are fewer objects in between. So in an urban area it can sometimes be easier to gauge a distance. In nature, sometimes, especially when you have large flat areas like fields and things like that, it can be a little bit difficult to tell how far something is really, how far away an object is. Or at least that's just something I've noticed. But I'm not an expert on gauging distance to the objects. Anyway, I'm continuing to work on this dirt road here in the middle. And notice how I'm trying to work around that puddle. I'm going to try to keep it clean, and I'm going to try to keep it very light, because this puddle here is reflecting, or at least its main portion to the left is reflecting those clouds on the horizon. So that's the lightest part of my scene, and that's why the part of the puddle that's reflecting that part of the sky is going to be also very light and almost completely white. Now this puddle here is going to have a slightly irregular shape, and the part of the puddle which is kind of under the tree or below the tree in my scene, that part of the puddle is obviously going to be reflecting a part of the canopy of the tree. Notice how I'm drawing these small blades of grass around the edge of the puddle to make its edge more convincing. And I'm also drawing a few smaller reflections of those blades of grass which are sticking out above the surface of the puddle. I want to make the puddle reflect a few of those blades of grass. So these small suggestions or reflections really go a long way when you're drawing surfaces like water surfaces like waters, like lakes and rivers and things like that. So this puddle has a very irregular shape. It's kind of stretching across this dirt road and flowing a little bit further to the foreground on the right. And this is the darker bit that the puddle is reflecting, that part of the canopy of the tree. That's why the puddle is a lot darker here on the right. I'm not really sure how much value I need to put in. Also, the shape of that reflection, I can't really make it exactly exactly like it should be. I'm just kind of approximating. If I can make it look close enough, it'll be good enough to create that illusion that we're looking at a reflection. But a few suggestions of these lighter areas where we can see the light of the sky coming through the canopy, that'll probably do the trick. I'm adding some suggestions of smaller clumps of grass to the grassy part of this dirt path. And refining the texture a little bit by adding a few blades of grass here and there, adding some smaller, finer details, and also adding a little bit of shadow under these clumps of grass which are sticking out. And because when I say they're sticking out, I mean these are raised parts of the ground which are which stand out above the dirt road and the puddle a little bit, and that's why I'm adding a bit of shadow under them. Now, in addition to those short marks that I use to create indications of blades of grass, I can just drag my pencil a little bit and create some random texture. That's another trick that I like to use, because that also helps me make the scene look a bit more complex. It creates that illusion of detail. It's very important for you to try to create an illusion of detail with as little effort as possible, because if you try to draw every single detail, a drawing like this will probably take dozens of hours rather than just a couple of hours. And this is a scene that you can do in only a couple of hours. I think I needed about maybe 2.5 hours altogether, but it probably could have been done even faster. The thing is that whichever drawing you decide to do, and regardless of whether you've already done similar drawings, there will always be some things which will surprise you a little bit. There will always be some obstacles, some things that you didn't really predict, and some things where you need to adapt a little bit, make some decisions, decide how to convey or interpret certain elements of your reference photo. So each and every drawing has its challenges, I suppose. You can see now that I've worked all the way around those puddles how nicely they stand out against the rest of the road and the grass. Now what I need to do is keep working on the grass here in the foreground, refining its texture, and then I'll be able to finish the work on those on the rest of the puddle on the right, and then I have a little bit more grass and another field on the right. So you can see that this part of the puddle on the right is kind of extending into the foreground, where the water is kind of flowing. Well, it's not flowing, it's stagnant, but it's extending into the foreground because it has an irregular shape and it's going down the length of that dirt path on the right. And that part of the puddle is a bit darker because it's actually a lot darker because it's reflecting the canopy of the tree above. So what I'm doing here is I'm drawing some suggestions of shadow areas on the edge of the field to the right, and then on the edge between the grassy area and the dirt path, because as I've already explained, the grass, even this shorter grass here closer to the road is slightly raised above the road, and it's going to have a little bit of shadow under those clumps of grass. And again, the blades of grass which are closer to us are going to be a little bit taller and larger, which is why I used longer strokes there. Now the texture here looks a little bit ugly, but once I start softening it with a brush and blending it with a brush, it's going to start to look a little bit better, a little bit more natural, but also a little bit darker in the process. And then once I'm happy with those shadow areas that I've put in using a combination of a pencil and a willow charcoal stick, then I can start refining that with a pencil eraser. So I want to make the edge of the grass here on the right as irregular as possible, like we have some of these clumps of grass growing out into the side of the road. This is a muddy countryside road, so part of it is overgrown with grass, and it has a very irregular shape. And now I'm adding a bit of random texture to the dirt path, because I want to make it look a little more rough and a little more uneven. I want to just make it look smooth. So I'm just dragging my pencil, allowing it to create an illusion of detail by creating some random marks, just some random textures. Now here I resharpen my pencil eraser and I'm starting to work on the grass. Now if you're having difficulty interpreting this area here, I wanted it to look like a bit of grass growing on the side of the road, where the grass which is closest to the road is very short, and then it's kind of getting taller, and then there's that field on the right. So that shadow area to the right is supposed to mark the edge between the field and that grass on the side of the road, if that makes sense. So I'm putting some finishing touches on this puddle here, refining the edge and adding some lighter details on that reflection to make the reflection look a bit more convincing. And I'm also adding some marks here to make it look like some tracks in the mud, just to make this muddy road a bit more interesting. And I'm blending that, softening that a little bit with a brush because I don't want these to be too conspicuous. And now I'm going to do a bit more work on this field to the right, basically doing the same thing that I did on the left. I'm going to draw a whole bunch of these vertical lines, vertical shapes, to reflect the shape and the size of those wheat stalks. And the ones that are closer to us are going to be taller, and the ones which are further away are going to be getting shorter and shorter and kind of merging with other shapes. And I'm gonna add a few darker areas here and there to make it look like there's a little bit of space in that field, a little bit of a shadow area here and there. And now I'm softening that with a brush. It still needs to be a bit darker, so I'm going to keep adding those darker marks using a pencil, using a charcoal pencil. I added a few more clouds here on the right because I remembered that I didn't put those in. I forgot to put the clouds on the right above those trees in the background. I'm cleaning up the edge of these fields on the left as well as the right, making that a bit lighter and making that stand out against the trees. And I'm kind of adding these lighter marks, these highlights, using a pencil eraser, and again varying the shape and the direction just a little bit so that I could make this look a bit more random and a bit more organic and not too uniform and too regular. And sometimes when the marks are supposed to be really short, I can just drag my pencil eraser a little bit. I'm putting down some finishing touches on this tree as well, softening a little bit of that texture. Because the tree is a little bit further away, I don't want the texture to be too distracting. And just refining some of these details, putting down some finishing touches before I remove that tape and spray the drawing with a bit of fixative. So here the drawing is done. I've removed the tape and I sprayed it with a bit of fixative, but when you do that you need to be careful that you've cleaned up your drawing and that you're pretty much done with your drawing, because once you spray it with a fixative there's usually not much you can do. And I like to put down a lot of fixative on my charcoal drawings. So the drawing is done. I've put my signature in the lower left corner where it won't bother anybody, I suppose. If you like my content, don't forget to give me a like, subscribe to my channel, and if you want to see more content and longer videos, you should check out my Patreon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.